So the first thing I'm going to do is read through the code and put all the different variables I see into my data memory. So to do that, I'll start with .alloc. It'll tell the computer how much space I need in data memory for all my variables. So the first variable I see is read in. So I'm going to type a variable in and then .data after that. N doesn't have a value, so it's not going to equal anything right now. Next, I'll need a variable for k, since in the loop k equals 1, so .data is going to equal 1. Then in the loop, I'm going to need a variable for n, which I already have, so after that would be sum equals 0. So I'm going to type a variable for sum, and then .data, and that equals 0. After that would be j, and that equals 1, so .data equals 1. Then I already have k, and I already have print sum, I already have sum in my data memory. So that looks like all my variables, and there's 4 in total. So I'm going to have my allocated data memory space to be 4. So I'm going to start the program with .begin, and then I'm going to put my ending codes, which are halt and then .end. So the first thing to do is read in. So to do that, I'll type the command read and then the variable in. So next is the beginning of the for loop. So because I know at some point we'll need to branch back to the beginning of the for loop, I'll start with typing my branch identifier to come back, and that'll just be for, called for. And so next, the first thing in this for loop to do is to compare if k is less than or equal to n, is the check that we'll have to do to go into the loop. So to do that, first we're going to have to load k into the accumulator and then compare if it is less than or equal to n. So compare if less than or equal to is CLT equal to CLE n. It's comparative less than or equal to n. And after that, if it's false, we'll have to immediately branch. So we branch if false to break out of the loop if it's false would be the next thing sequentially to do. So if it's false, I'm going to branch if false out of the loop. So I'll call that out. And I'll immediately put where out will be, which is at the end of the program, which will be at halt. So if k is not less than or equal to n, then we'll immediately break out of the loop, which would be at halt. If k is less than or equal to n, then we're inside the loop, and the first thing that happens is sum is set to 0 every time we restart the loop. I know that in order to set sum equal to 0, I would need to store 0 into the variable sum from the accumulator. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called 0 so that I can store 0 into sum. In my data memory, I'll add the variable 0, then .data, and that will equal 0. Now I'm going to load 0 into the accumulator and then store 0 into sum, which would set sum equal to 0 every time this loop restarts. So next, we go into the second for loop. So at this line, we'll need to branch back into the for loop, and I'll call it for2. To go into the second for loop, we have to compare if j is less than or equal to k. To do that, we're going to have to load j into the accumulator and then compare if less than or equal to, so CLE, compare if less than or equal to k. So the next thing we'll do is if j is not less than or equal to k, we'll need to break out of the loop to the next thing, which is print sum. So on this line, we'll have to write branch if false to the line where we would print the sum, and I'll call it print. So next I'll write the line where it branches to, which is called print, but I won't fill in the print sum code just yet. I'm going to go in order and finish writing the loop. Okay, so next we have sum plus equals j. To do that, we're going to need to take sum, add j to it, and then save that value into sum. So to do that step by step, the code would be to load sum in the accumulator, then add j, now sum plus j is in the accumulator, so what's left is to store that into sum. This is the last line of our second for loop. So after this, I put to unconditionally branch back to the beginning of our second for loop, which is called for 2. But then I realized that before we start our loop again, we have to increase j by 2. At the end of our for loop parentheses, it says j plus equals 2. So we're going to have to take j, add 2 to it, and then save it into j again. So before we branch back up, we're going to load j into the accumulator, add the immediate value 2, so add I equals 2, and then store that back into j. So after this, we're going to keep going through our second for loop until j is not less than or equal to k. At that point, we'll break out of the loop, which is our branch if false, to the next line, which is print sum. We already have our branch if false line labeled as print, so on that line we'll write print sum, which is write sum. This is the last line of our first for loop, so after this we would have to loop back up to start our first for loop again. We already have the beginning of our first for loop labeled as for, so all we would need to write is our unconditional branch to branch back up to for. So now we're going back to the beginning of our first for loop, which will go through our entire code again until k is not less than or equal to n. And at that point, we'll branch if false out of the program entirely to halt. And again, I almost forgot that before we can loop back into the first for loop, we have to increase k. K++ means we're going to increase k by 1. To do that, we're going to load k into the accumulator, then increment k, which adds 1 to it, and then store it back into k. Now this should be the end of our code, because after this we'll loop back into the first for loop, which goes through our entire code again until k is not less than or equal to n, which would break us out of the loop and end the program. So now I'm going to go into the terminal to test the code and make sure it works. To test, we do /hasm.crun space the name of my program. So at this point, I'm scrolling up to check and make sure that I have no errors and it says that the execution ended normally. So now I'm going to scroll to the bottom and start my code, which will start with me reading in the variable n. N is the last odd number that the program will print out. If n is 1, it'll just print 1. If n is 3, it'll print 1 and then 3. And if n is 5, it'll print 1, then 3, and then 5. I want the program to print all the odd numbers until 11, so I'll read n as 11. Okay, so the program ran, and I'm going to scroll up to the top to see what it did. So I'm going to focus on the arrows. The first one shows me reading in 11, and then anytime k is an even number, it won't go into that second for loop. So sum equals 0, and it'll print sum as 0 for all the even numbers. Okay, so the next arrow is it printing 3, and then again for the even number it prints 0. And then it prints 5, and then 0, and then 7, and then 0, and then 9, and then 0, and then 11. The code prints all the odd numbers until 11, so it works.